Hello, everyone. This is Dr. Jenkins, and this very well may be the last recorded lecture for you to listen to for the semester. That's kind of exciting. There might be some background noise. I've got the windows open, the birds are chirping, spring has come. Well, maybe for now, but I bet you it'll be flurrying and like 40 degrees next week. All right, anyway, so this is going to be the video on the foot and ankle. So it's going to be what you need to know for this chapter for our upcoming exam on Thursday, right? So I'm going to try and move pretty quickly. You're not going to need to know everything. So I'm going to move quickly and really try and point out the most of what you need to know. So we ended in lecture in person talking about the actual true ankle joint, which is the talocrural joint. We mentioned the distal tibiofibular joint. We mentioned the anterior tibiofibular ligament, which is damaged in the high ankle sprain. And then we talked about the true ankle joint, which is the talus, tibia and fibula. It is a hinge joint, and it can do dorsiflexion and plantar flexion. We talked about that it gets its strength about half and half, 50% from bones, 50% from ligaments. And we began to discuss some of the ligaments, right? So on the, let's see what color, let me use green. On the lateral side of the talocrural joint or true ankle joint, we have the T-shaped ligaments, anterior and posterior talofibular ligaments. The ATF is the one that's most commonly injured in a regular ankle sprain. And then I mentioned the calcaneofibular ligament, and these are all named for the bones they connect. That's on the lateral side. And then on the medial side, we had a collection of ligaments altogether known as the deltoid. I was saying medial, and I meant to write, these are altogether known as the deltoid ligaments, medial side of the true ankle joint. Okay, so we're going to move on here. And the next joint I want to talk about is the subtalar joint. This is the joint between the talus and the calcaneus. The talus is that dome-shaped bone. So I'm going to put in green. Here's the talus in green. And then the calcaneus, of course, is our heel bone, right? So there's our calcaneus, and this red line here shows the joint, actually. The talus wait a minute. I'm trying to move a little too quickly here, and look what's happening. The talus comes down here, so here's the talus. Let me do a better job. There's the talus. I included some of the fibula by accident. So it's the joint between the talus and the calcaneus. This is a really important joint. This is a gliding joint, so there's not a whole lot of motion that we can see with our naked eyes. But these gliding motions, allow our foot to do inversion and eversion. So I want to be kind of nuanced about this. It's not that inversion and eversion happen at the subtalar joint, but it's that the gliding motions here allow for inversion and eversion. And this is written in your notes here, right? The inversion and eversion are allowed because of the gliding motions. Okay. You can see in your notes, I've got some information on pronation and supination. Sometimes we can use the words pronation and supination as a way to combine all the motions at the ankle, but you don't need to know these, okay? You don't need to know them. What we talked about is that plantar flexion and dorsiflexion occur at the talocrural joint. Inversion and eversion involve all the joints, but they are helped by the gliding motions at the subtalar joint. And if you need to, you can stop and rewind and hear me say it again. Okay, good, but you don't need to know those. I do want to talk about a very important ligament here at the subtalar joint. And I'm going to go back. It's called, you can see it on your list there, calcaneonavicular ligament. Let's see if I can find a good picture of the calcaneonavicular, wait a minute. Calcaneonavicular ligament. That's the calcaneofibular. Here it is. Let me use red. So there's a calcaneonavicular ligament. It goes between the calcaneus and the navicular, which is a bone a little bit more in the midfoot. Okay, it's on the medial side, so we're talking about the calcaneonavicular ligament. The name of it tells us where it is. We talked about this as important around the subtalar joint, or the joint that we just talked about between the talus and the calcaneus. It's on the medial side of the ankle. It's a little bit more anterior. This is called the spring ligament. It even says it down here, spring ligament. It's called the spring ligament because it's responsible, it plays a role in the springing off when we toe off during gait, when we walk. Every step you take, you land on your heel, then you kind of become flat-footed, right? And then when you toe off with every step you take, some of that propulsion for toe off comes from this calcaneonavicular or spring ligament. Okay. I've given you some information in your notes on the mid-tarsal joints. You don't need to know these. Don't need to know them. The tarso-metatarsal joints. You don't need to know these either. I pause there because I usually have you know them, but I'm just trying to simplify a little bit because we don't have as much time, so you don't need to know that either. Let's talk about the metatarsophalangeal or MTP joints. I would like you to know a little bit about these. This is the equivalent of the quote-unquote knuckles in our hands. If you remember the metacarpophalangeal, the MCP, the metacarpophalangeal were our knuckles in our hands. Metacarpo, well now we're at metatarso. Tarso means foot. So this is the equivalent of like the knuckles of our foot. And just like our hand, these are condyloid joints. So I would like you to know that. Condyloid, like a mini ball and socket. So we can know, if we say mini ball and socket, we know that they can do flexion and extension, abduction, adduction. Flexion and extension, abduction, adduction. The interphalangeal joints, just like our hands, are hinge joints, which means that they can do flexion and extension. Just like our hands, the first digit, here it's the big toe, only has 2 bones, which means 1 interphalangeal joint. So here we only have 1 interphalangeal joint, but for all the others, we have 2. Okay. All right. Let's talk about the supporting structures. And we've already mentioned a lot of these. And again, I'm going to move quickly and just point out what you need to know. So let's first talk about ligaments. The first ligament I want to discuss is the anterior tibiofibular ligament. Just review, we've already talked about this, just review what joint this is associated with. This is a ligament of, this is a review hopefully, This is a ligament of the distal tibiofibular joint. This is injured in a high ankle sprain. It's higher up there. Yep. Okay. We'll talk about this a little bit later. You don't need to know this, what I'm about to say. That high ankle sprain, sometimes it's called a syndesmotic injury, syndesmosis injury, because this arrangement is called a syndesmosis, how the tibia and fibula come down over the talus. Usually this high ankle sprain happens not only with forced eversion, or inversion, I guess it could happen too, but dorsiflexion. So this, again, you don't need to know this, but high ankle sprains typically happen with a twisting motion, but also that forced dorsiflexion. As a group, we already mentioned at the talocrural joint, so please just remember what joints these ligaments are associated with. At the talocrural joint on the medial side, we had a ligament complex called the deltoid ligament complex. It's a whole bunch of ligaments collectively known as the deltoid ligaments, and that's this one right here. These are strong, rarely injured. They are strong, that's true, but they're also rarely injured because the mechanism isn't as common. Next here, we have the calcaneonavicular ligament, which we just talked about, calcaneonavicular. This is part of the subtalar joint. So just know what joint it's associated with. Again, we're on the medial side. And this is our spring ligament, calcaneonavicular. Plays a role in propulsion with every step that we take. This is a really important ligament. So if we continue this up here, it's very important. It's hard for me because I want to get into all the details, but with time I can't. Not only is it important for that elasticity, so mostly ligaments are there to hold bones together and give support. They're there to hold bones together, and we don't usually want a whole lot of elasticity. We want a little bit, but not a whole lot, right? But here it's a little bit different. Not only is this helping to hold two bones together, but we actually want more elasticity, precisely for that push-off motion. And as a result of its added elasticity, it also helps a little bit with shock absorption. Okay. Good. Trying to be very intentional with what you need to know. On the lateral side, we have the lateral talocrural ligaments. These are all at the talocrural joint, or the true ankle joint. We have the anterior talofibular. This is the most commonly injured of the ankle. We're on the lateral side now. Of all the ankle ligaments, this is the most commonly injured. It is the weakest. It's pretty short, as you can see in your notes here, but it's most commonly injured. We have a posterior talofibula. Remember I said that these kind of form a T? That's what I'm trying to show you with these red lines. And then we have the calcaneofibular, which is the bottom. So just be able to identify the three. Here's a picture just to show you the most common type of ankle sprain. It's called an inversion ankle sprain. We're going to come back to this later. Most common. And this picture kind of shows you why the anterior talofibular is going to be the most common. It's weaker and just where it's positioned, most commonly injured. All right. So we have these arches, and what the heck are arches? Arches are thick bands of connective tissue, very thick bands. And they're very specifically designed bands of connective tissue. Because if we think about the arches, what are their functions? And if you look at the ankle and the foot, have you ever taken a moment? Probably not. But if we notice the bones, the bones are purposely arranged so that there's this big space. It's not just like the foot is flat. And that's because we need to have this ability to absorb shock. So when we land, every step we take, when we land, that foot and the bones flatten out. And that's a way to absorb shock. So these arches function to kind of help with that motion. It's this thick connective tissue right up against the bones. And so when we land, every step that we take absorbs shock. And these are elastic. They have elasticity. So they're thick and they're strong, but they're also elastic. So thick and strong, but also elastic. So that when we land with every step we take, the bones kind of flatten out and the arches flatten out also. And that's a form of shock absorption. It has to be this way. We don't just want to have bones that we just land on as they are flat. It's by design that they flatten out. And that process is a way of shock absorption. And then the other function is elasticity and spring. If we want to correlate these with the phases of gait, we need the shock absorption as we land, with each step we take as we land. So landing, phase of gait. Whereas these are needed during the push-off phase of gait. So we have to have an ability when we put all of our body weight on one foot to absorb that shock as we land. But then we also need that elasticity. So where the arches will flatten out as we land, then they can spring back and help us to push off. A couple of things to say here, which you don't need to know. My cats are fighting. The medial portion is more flexible. You don't need to know that. An interesting note, again, not on the test, but an interesting note, the height of an arch is not necessarily telling of its strength. Okay. We have these longitudinal arches. So these are showing you the longitudinal. And that just means the arches run this way, the length of the foot. There's a medial and lateral. But just know there's a couple that are longitudinal and run the length of the foot. And then we actually have a transverse arch also that runs medial to lateral. Okay. There's the cadaver foot because you've always wanted to see that, haven't you? You don't need to know anything more specifically about the two types other than that they're there. There's some that run longitudinal and one that runs transversely. We also have what's called a plantar fascia. Maybe you've heard of plantar fasciitis when this can get inflamed. Here it's called the plantar aponeurosis. It's this thick band. See this white colored band? That's what it is. This is anatomically superficial to the arches. So this is also a band of connective tissue, but it's a different band of connective tissue compared to the arches. Here it shows you, right? This one is just the last layer here, superficial. It assists in the other functions of the arches, but I just want you to know that it's superficial. Okay. When we're talking about the musculature, you can see on your notes here, I have the Achilles tendon. Everyone's heard of the Achilles tendon, right? The Achilles or calcaneal tendon is a combination of, let's see, I have that written down, I thought. The Achilles tendon is a combination of 3 muscles. Do I have a there we go. Here it's called calcaneal tendon. I'm going to use green. But we also refer to it as the Achilles tendon. Everybody, oh, that's my cat Oscar. Hello. We all know where it is. It's a combination of 3 muscle tendons. Not surprisingly, the gastrocnemius, soleus, which is right underneath it, but also a small little muscle called the plantaris. I mentioned this in lab. All these muscles collectively do ankle plantar flexion. Everyone knows the gastroc, the soleus is underneath it. There's a tiny little muscle. It's kind of cute right here. This is not the same as the popliteus, the plantaris. It's smaller. But look at this tendon from the plantaris. It's going to go all the way down, and it becomes part of the Achilles. As far as the muscles, okay, we're going to keep things pretty simple. Let's first look at the anterior musculature. The tibialis anterior does ankle dorsiflexion. I'm going to use a check mark. A check mark is shorthand for flexion, because I want to get through all this. And then we have some extensors. And these should kind of sound similar to the forearm. You don't need to know, well, actually, yeah, let's have you know a couple of them. When we see extensor digitorum, it extends the digits. Extends the digits, what are the digits? The toes. I would just like you to know that these are both on the anterior leg. The extensors are on the anterior side. When we see extensor hallucis, I usually see it spelled that way. Hallucis means big toe. So when we see extensor hallucis, it extends the big toe. The extensor digitorum extends the toes, usually 2 through 5. But the extensor hallucis extends the big toe. Let's go to the lateral musculature. We have a group of muscles called so we're lateral. You don't need to know the difference, but a group of muscles called the peroneals, peroneus longus, brevis, and tertius. These do ankle eversion. Just know as a group, the peroneals do ankle eversion. Posteriorly, we have the superficial ones, gastroc, soleus, and plantaris, all the ones that combine to form the Achilles tendon. Guess what? They do ankle plantar flexion. Then we have some deep posterior ones. We have the tibialis posterior, but also the flexors, flexor hallucis, flexor digitorum. The tibialis posterior is there. I pause because I'm not sure what I want you to know. But let's talk about the flexors. If you remember, the extensors were on the anterior side of the leg. Our flexors are on the posterior side, and they're deep. We're deep to the gastroc and the soleus. As such, and when we see flexor digitorum does toe flexion. And then when we see hallucis, flexes the big toe. Flexes the big toe. These are sometimes called the Tom, Dick, and Harry muscles. You don't have to know that. It's interesting. If you're interested, don't need to know this, feel free to tune me out. All these muscles, even though they're on the posterior side, their tendons wrap around the medial malleolus and actually attach under the toe. Tom, Dick, and Harry. Posterior tibialis, flexor, whatever. But you don't need to know those. You also don't need to know the intrinsic muscles of the foot. You don't need to know those, if you're okay with that. Okay, so as I've been before, I like to provide more information and some numbers, but you don't need to know all those. We are going to focus only on what you need to know. Okay. So if we look at the kinetics, the forces, load distribution, we basically have two main types of loads. And that's what I'm trying to frame here. Two main types of loads at the ankle. Two main types of loads. One of them is a compression, sometimes called vertical impact, but really it's compression. When we land, that's what I've been saying, when we land, right? Look at this arrow. Every time we land, heel strike, when we land, that is a compression force. We also have a propulsion force that occurs during push-off. This one is obviously compression, so it's a load pushing bones together. This is a tension, as the arrows are suggesting. I know this slide might look confusing, but it's basically saying the same thing that we've been saying. Okay, two main types of loads. This is basically, if you look at your note, number 3, loads during walking and running. Vertical impact occurs first. So we have this compression. You can just say compression when we land. And then we have a tension force when we push off. This gives you some numbers, but you don't need to know the numbers. Okay. Back to this, if you look at the top, number 1, bony, it's at the top of my notes. Number 1, bony support. Number 2, soft tissue support. So during these loads, and I'll make a little sidebar here. During these loads, and it's just like we talked about with the talocrural joint. Didn't we say the talocrural joint gets its strength from 50% bony support and 50% ligaments? It's saying the same thing here. We get, during these phases of walking and running, we rely on the bones and the ligaments. I give you some more specifics about how at the bones, we first rely on the talus and the calcaneus, which is the rear foot, and then we rely on the forefoot. But you don't need to know those specifics. When we talk about the soft tissue support, it's mostly ligaments. We do get some support also from the arches and sometimes tendons. So we could technically say 50% soft tissue, but it's really mostly ligaments. I just want to mention arches. because we did mention arches. So included in this soft tissue, ligaments and arches, but we already talked about that. So I'm just reminding you that we rely on the ability to withstand these forces, 50% ligaments and 50% bones. Okay. How does this compare to the hip and knee? If we go back here, we see some forces, 2.5 times body weight, 2.8 times body weight. This is higher. So if one of the main points here is there's less force. You can't even read my handwriting. I'm trying to get through this quickly. It's not going that well, is it? Nah, it's going just fine. Less force at ankle and foot compared to hip and knee. Which is kind of surprising. You would think that, oh my God, like the foot is the actual contact point. But there aren't as big. Sometimes the reason why it's more at the hip and the knee is because there's larger muscles pulling at it. I mean, think about the quads and the hamstrings. They're huge. So that actually provides a lot of force. But less force here at the ankle and the foot. That's all I'm saying here. Less force at the ankle and the foot. I do want to talk quickly about this conversion of energy. When we land, another way of saying at stance is when we land. So we're talking about this one. When we land, the arches are stretched. This does shock absorption, but it also stores energy. Additionally, there is some eccentric tension in the gastroc and the soleus. We're loading potential energy here. So basically, when we land and have this stance, we have to do shock absorption, but also load potential energy. So if I was going to really think about the functions of when we land, we have to do shock absorption because we're landing. All of our body weight is going down. But we also have to load potential energy in other structures. This is potential energy that we're later going to activate to help push us off. Where do we load this potential energy? In the gastroc and soleus and that calcaneonavicular ligament. So we have to do shock absorption, but also other structures are stretched to load potential energy so that when we push off, all that stored energy is released. And it's kind of like a rubber band. Here in the first one, in stance or landing, we're stretching the rubber band. We're stretching the arches. We're stretching that calcaneonavicular ligament. And then when we push off, it's like releasing that rubber band. And that gives us the propulsion. These will most likely be multiple choice questions. Because it's kind of so late in the game here, imagine multiple choice questions for this stuff, not necessarily short answer, which should make it easier. Okay. I'm just going to end with a couple things here, and then we'll be done. Kinetic chain. Look at letter C. All you need to know is number 1. Loads are transmitted up the lower extremity. So sometimes, if something is wrong at the ankle or foot, It can affect the knee, the hip, and the lower back even. This can be in regards to injury, or it can also be compensation, right? If someone has pronated feet, their knees might respond by doing more internal rotation to compensate. But you don't need to know specific examples, just that loads are transmitted up. Okay. This we would have done part of it in lab, but we didn't get to it. I do actually want to point out some definitions real quick. Let's see. What am I going to have you know? Because I'm going to end in about 5 minutes here. I think something that might be worthwhile for you to know, and these are old shoes, okay? This is probably maybe even like 10 years old, so my apologies. So ignore the actual types of shoes, but let's just do some quick definitions, and then we're going to get out of here in the next 5 minutes. Pes planus is the fancy word for flat feet. So if someone has abnormally flat arches, that's called pes planus. Pes cavus is someone that has an abnormally high arch, the opposite. You know, if you go to Fleet Feet or a store, a running shoe store like that or something, they can do a quick arch and foot analysis. And there are certain shoe designs for certain types of arches. Those who have flat feet will likely benefit from rigid shoes. Someone that has a high arch will likely benefit from a more flexible shoe design. Neutral, somewhere in between. But there are certain models of shoes that are kind of designed this way. I do want to say really quickly, if someone has a flat foot, pes planus, but doesn't have any symptoms or pain or whatever, just let it be, right? So when I say abnormally flat feet, it doesn't mean that they're having pain and whatever. They just might have flat feet, and that's fine. The body's compensated. But sometimes they can benefit from a particular type of shoe. Okay. There's all these trends, 15 years ago, the barefoot style was popular. I think it's kind of gone away now. Here's what pes planus, flat feet, looks like. Pes cavus, high arch. Know those definitions. You don't need to know any of these. Let's see. Let's just mention hallux valgus. You may have seen someone with this, like a bunion, as it says in your notes. And I'm just pointing out what you need to know, right? We said pes planus, pes cavus, what shoe is best, flexible or rigid. And then hallux valgus is when there's a protrusion out this way, can lead to a bunion. Hallux means big toe. Valgus means it's from a lateral force. There are other abnormalities. People usually cringe at these pictures, but they happen. You don't need to know them. In terms of phases of gait, you don't need to know anything more that we've already talked about. All we talked about was what's happening when we land, or the stance phase, shock absorption, loading potential energy, landing or stance phase, and then what happens when we toe off. All that potential energy is released to help with propulsion. You don't need to know any of these. I mean, we talked about the stance and the toe off or propulsion. Everything else here you don't need to know other than what we talked about. Some of this is a review, some of it is new. Just go back to what we talked about previously. I just wanted to remind you that a high ankle sprain involves the anterior tibiofibular. We talked about that already. The most common is an ATF, or anterior talofibular ligament. This is called an inversion ankle sprain, where the ankle rolls in, and the rest is all extra. Okay. Any questions, let me know. Good luck, everyone, and keep working hard. We're almost done.